everybody. Welcome to Connecticut's Old State House. We are so pleased to have you here today. My name is Sally Whipple. I'm the director of Connecticut's Old State House, and I'm the business portion of the session. I want to let you know that this is planned by the Old State House and funded by the Connecticut Humanities Council, so we thank them for their funding of our entire series. I also want to remind you to turn off your cell phones. And we know that this is a lunchtime program, and many people have to leave this place to go back to work. So if you have to leave and the program is still going on, don't feel self-conscious about leaving. We know that you have to get back to work. I also want to let you know that you each have a program on your chair filled with brochures about some of our upcoming events. Our goal this summer is to keep downtown as busy as possible. So please come back for free lectures, concerts, and our farmers market, which starts with a preview tomorrow afternoon. And there will also be a survey in your packet, and we would like you to fill that survey out for us as well. Again, we're very happy to have you here today. We're pleased to have Diane Smith back with us again to have a conversation with Governor Lowell Weicker. Thank you, Diane.
Thank you, Sally. That's for you, Governor. They never do that for me. I do these all the time, and we never start with applause, so that's for you.
Well, I haven't heard any applause ever since I passed the income tax.
Well, hopefully you'll hear a little bit more today. I want to thank everybody for coming and also let you know that while you're here for this live program today, CTN, the Connecticut Network, is taping this as a program that will run not only on the air on CTN, but will also be available for you to watch on demand within the next couple of days. The program should air numerous times over the summer and probably into the fall as well, and then it will be available more or less indefinitely, permanently, if you go to our link, and that's www.ct-n.com. So for those that couldn't be here today, I know there were a number of people who wanted to come and couldn't make it. You can forward them that link if you'd like. I have so many questions for you, Governor, that I could talk to you the entire time, but we promised the audience they'd get a chance to ask a few. And so I'm going to give you people an opportunity, all of you, a chance to ask some questions, so please don't be shy about that. I'll start with a very short introduction. Governor Lowell Weicker has been on the political scene in Connecticut since 1962, when he won a state house seat from Greenwich, where he also served as first selectman. From there, he went to Congress, the U.S. Senate, and then in 1990 ran as an independent and, of course, won the election for governor. In the last few years, we haven't heard as much from Lowell Weicker as I would have liked, so it seemed like a good time for us to reconnect, and I'm so happy that you decided to join us today. Thank you so much. Governor, I see you, and I've told you this, I see you as one of the towering figures in modern Connecticut political history, and yet as I was rereading your book, I realized it almost never happened, because you had an intent to go to Seattle. Go west, young man.
I did. Right after I graduated from the University of Virginia Law School, took off in a station wagon with my wife and small child, expecting to get a job in Seattle. At that time, there was only one employer in Seattle. It was called the Boeing Company. And if the Boeing Company shut down, believe me, Seattle shut down. There was no Microsoft or any tech companies. But when I arrived there, Boeing was shut down. And I hung around for about 6 months trying to get a job. No luck. Got an offer from a firm in Greenwich, Connecticut. Back to Connecticut, and there. Onward from there.
And the interesting thing is, if you had stayed in Seattle, you might never have made it to the Senate, because they had some pretty strong...
Right, never would have, because you had Warren Magnuson and Scoop Jackson, both of whom were in the United States Senate for a long, long time.
It's interesting how things work out. I want to talk to you just a little bit about your time as first selectman of Greenwich, as well as when you were the state rep, because one of the things you said about it is that, in a sense, I was a Republican raised as a Democrat, which is sort of an interesting concept. But your power base, really, in Greenwich were not necessarily the people that most of us think of when we think of Greenwich. There were a lot of working-class families that came to help elect you.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I had, well, for example, my initial political base was the Chickahominy section of Greenwich, which was the Italian working-class section of Greenwich. A wonderful man by the name of Pete DiStefano was the man that really took me under his wing. So that's how I started within the town. But I think it's also important to point out that There's no way that you can represent the state of Connecticut and come at it with a Greenwich frame of mind. I mean, this is a state that is a state of small cities. It's a state of large minorities, both black and Latino, blue collar, very poor sections of the state. And if you're going to represent that, you just can't think of your constituency of Greenwich. You've got to broaden your point of view, which in essence is what happened once I moved to become a congressman out of the 4th District. My problem right now with the Republican Party of the state of Connecticut is that they follow the rules of the Republican National Committee. The Republican National Committee has become a religious right, rural party, and that's not Connecticut. If Republicans want to win in Connecticut, and they haven't done very much winning lately, they've got to represent the demographic, which is the state of Connecticut, which is a very broad-based demographic. So it's a lesson that I learned early on. I just hope Republicans learn it early on in the state of Connecticut, because mind you this, we do not do well as a one-party state. No state would.
Interesting. I want to skip over, actually, your time in Congress just to get into the Senate, because you had a three-way race for Senate against Tom Dodd and Joe Duffy. And you said at one point that you had one regret, a comment that you made about Tom Dodd during a debate.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was a little tough on Tom Dodd. He was going through some problems at that time, personal problems. And I made the comment because Joe Duffy came from the left wing of the Democratic Party, and I made the statement that between Dodd and Duffy, that it's the Dodds and the Duffys of this world that create the problems. It's what enabled me as a sort of a middle-of-the-road type to come in between the two of them. But I've never been a good negative campaigner, and I didn't even like that comment when I made it. The second time in my political career that I decided to go negative and then stopped it very fast was the race against Joe Lieberman, when clearly Lieberman had taken over in the polls, and I pointed out, ironically, that Lieberman had voted for a state income tax when he was in the legislature. Notice I said ironically. And I made that point in a personal ad. And within 48 hours, his numbers plummeted and mine went up. And after 48 hours, I said, I'm not going to do this. This just is not right. And I have to say that I don't think it's very right as to how we're running political campaigns in the United States now, where it's one negative after another, both by Republicans and by Democrats. I realize it works. I'm not stupid. It works and still works. But it's no way to go ahead and inspire people to serve their country.
And people would say that that campaign was very negative on Mr. Lieberman's side.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, sure it was. I was the bear in the cave.
Mm-hmm.
And my wife will tell you I'm still the bear in the cave. But in any event, it was what it was. My own feeling, the reason why I lost the campaign to Joe Lieberman was twofold. Number one, I was lazy, because I've loved campaigning. And I've been very much one who likes to walk and meet and greet and be all over the place. That was my laziest campaign. I did less of that in that campaign. So I'll take that first on my shoulders. The second part of it is that I had asked my constituency, the state of Connecticut, to come up to the mark on controversial issues too many times. Whether starting with Watergate, or whether my involvement with the cure for AIDS and for the gay people. Anyway, whether it was not wanting to see people hauled off because they burned the flag. There were just too many issues that were controversial. And there's no question in my mind that the people of Connecticut said, we want a little rest from all this pot stirring, and we'll elect Joe Lieberman.
Well, they didn't get a very long rest, though, because you came back. I want to say, because we're in the beautiful old State House, this is where you chose to announce a run for president. Let's talk a little bit about that.
That was 1980, and I felt that I could bring a good voice to the Republican Party in presidential politics. I said I learned early on there was going to be only one candidate, and his name was Ronald Reagan. And I got out of the race very early because I didn't want to waste my resources knowing that I had a Senate race coming up. Mm-hmm. I will tell you a story, though, because my every-time campaign manager, except once, the time I lost, Tom DeMoore is in the audience. And Tom went up to New Hampshire to sort of be the advance man to talk with the press in New Hampshire. Well, the press in New Hampshire, as you know, is rather conservatively oriented, starting with the Manchester Union Leader. Well, it wasn't that newspaper. It was another one that was just as conservative. And Tom went in to see the managing editor. And in the course of the conversation, he turns to Tom DeMoore. He says, Mr. DeMoore, he said, Mr. DeMoore, I want to tell you something. We got commies in this state. And I want to tell you, even our commies don't like your commie. So much for my run for the presidency.
Governor, I think that this is such an opportune time that we're having you visit with us, because this coming weekend will actually be the 40th anniversary of the Watergate break-in, and your role in investigating that really brought you to national attention at an early stage of your Senate career. This past weekend, Woodward and Bernstein wrote in the Washington Post that Watergate was worse than the American people knew at the time. Would you agree with that?
Totally. Yeah, I don't think anybody really could understand the viciousness of the thoughts that crossed Richard Nixon's mind. The man had a total disregard, never mind for the Constitution of the United States, that's bad enough, but for different individuals within our society, whether by faith or ethnicity or politics. It was a pretty ornery way to look at your fellow citizens. I suppose what worries me is that these things can only occur if all of us, the voting population, is off on a spree doing something else, not caring about our politics or our government. You know, it's all right to blame everything that's going on in Washington today on Washington. But that's not the reason why it's going on. It's going on because none of us care. We're not expressing ourselves. I mean, it's outrageous. I'll be honest with you. It's outrageous what's going on right now. I'm not saying it's as bad as Richard Nixon, but the two have a parallel. When you get only 45% of the people of the United States voting in presidential elections, then I'll tell you what happens. The extremes of right and left take over, and they have. Or you get a bad man like Richard Nixon becoming president of the United States, feeling he can do anything he wants to. There was a book, and I want to get my hands on it. It was a photographic essay of Watergate. It was the title of that book that is something to remember. It was entitled Because They Could Not Trust the King. And it was titled after the execution of Charles I in England and why he was executed after the Cromwell Revolution. Because they could not, the Parliament, the people, could not trust the king. Well, we don't have kings in this country. We have presidents. We have people that are elected. But right now, we're of a mind now where we don't trust anybody in positions of leadership. So if there's a letter to be learned from Watergate, I think it is that this one man decided that the Constitution wasn't for him, that he was above the law, and that he could do anything that he wanted to. And he almost got away with it. And just by that much was he reined in.
When you were chosen to be on the committee, was it something that you welcomed, or was it something that everybody else ran away from? So they said, Lowell Weicker will do it.
No, I wanted to be on the committee because I actually had started on election reform. And when Hugh Scott, who was the minority leader, came to me, he, I think, wanted somebody that had been involved with election reform. He also wanted a young man on there. He chose Howard Baker, who became the minority head of the committee, and Ed Gurney from Florida, a Southerner conservative. And I think he just wanted a young face on there. I very much welcome the opportunity to be on the committee. I started out, I've got to say, believing in Mr. Nixon's innocence. And it wasn't until I got into, and now we almost get back to another theme of what I had referred to earlier. It's not until I got into how he politicked in California that I started to understand the man. In California, he was a dirty campaigner, believe me. He took Helen Gahagan Douglas down by, in effect, accusing her of being a communist, etc. So the seeds were all there. The background was there. I still didn't swing over to the other side, but it certainly got me, my rabbit ears up, and I started to look deeper and deeper into what he had done, and then it became pretty clear that he had to go.
In fact, didn't you have your own investigation going on at the same time?
Well, people say that, but I don't think it's entirely accurate to the extent that obviously we had good committee staff on the Watergate committee, but I did allocate several people on my own staff to assist in the investigation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I had forgotten this. I don't know how many people know it, maybe some of the people here, but John Dean became a neighbor of yours, and actually when he moved out of town, you bought his townhouse.
I did. We lived right across the street from each other. And it was in one of my visits across the street to him that I found out about the enemies list. When I turned him, we'd been through several days of hearings, and I said, John, is there anything else that, crosses your mind? He said, well, I have something down in my basement in a cardboard box which might be of interest. And he brought up this sheet of paper, which was the enemies list, which listed various people that Nixon wanted to get even with. Yeah.
I'm going to switch over to the topic of the environment because I think we can all be honest here. You've been called a lot of names, but one that I never heard before was aquanaut, and that's actually what you are.
Yeah. After Watergate, I felt I'd been through enough negative activity. It was hard to look upon it as a positive effort, but anyway, and I wanted to do something on the positive side, and I had an opportunity to go down with a Marine Research Foundation and watch underwater living and in effect being on the bottom of the ocean floor for days at a time. My friend Tim Keeney, who's here, knows exactly what I'm talking about because he was a Navy SEAL and he's also done the living on the bottom of the ocean floor. In any event, I've done 4 saturation dives, living for 2 to 3 days at a time to examine the environment. And I might add at 81 years of age, which is like good news for all of you that are sort of close to my age. We can't play baseball, we can't play tennis, we can't go on hikes. You can still dive at 81 because you're buoyant as air and there is no pain. So take up diving, you'll love it. But in any event,
I love this picture of you, by the way.
Yeah, well, that was taken in the Bahamas before they moved the habitat, and it was a different habitat to St. Croix. Mm-hmm. But what bothers me, and I've got to say this to you now, I hear a lot of environmental talk, and I'm all for it. People should be involved with the environment. Listen, 3/4 of this Earth's surface is water. And I think the budget for underwater research at NOAA, somewhere around $10 million. My God, you're spending billions to go to the moon, and you don't understand what's right here at your doorstep, and where there's no question in my mind that you're going to have to go to for your water. Everybody talks about oil being valuable. Water is the number one substance that people are going to yearn for, or your energy, or your food, and we know nothing about it. So environmentally, it really isn't much further advanced. When I started my research activities mainly with Fairleigh Dickinson University down in St. Croix.
I know that Bob Ballard, the explorer, is a friend of yours, and Bob told me just a few years ago that the next generations, because, if they're given the opportunity to go under the sea, will be able to discover 10 times more in the next 10 years of the planet than we have discovered in all of human history.
It's true.
If they get the resources. It's mind-boggling.
But they don't have the resources. And I'll tell you a story which probably shouldn't, but anyway, because he was such a good friend of mine. But when Reagan became president, he named Mac Baldrige, who was the head of Scoville Manufacturing here in Connecticut, as his Commerce Secretary. Mac and I were very, very close friends. And he was a moderate Republican, great guy. In any event, he follows the orders from Reagan and Stockman to go ahead and nail the NOAA budget. More specifically, to eliminate the research vessels for NOAA. So he comes into my office with this budget, with all the research facilities eliminated. And I turned to him and said, Mac, what are you doing? He said, I'm part of this administration. I said, but you can't do this. He said, yes, I can. And he walked out of my office, and that was it. So I then turned to my wife, who was my now wife, who was then the administrator of the subcommittee, appropriations subcommittee. And you were, right, Claudia? Yeah, she was. And I said, Claudia, what do you think? Is there anything I can do? My wife's Italian. They have a way of coming back at you. And she suggested that I might want to go ahead and cut the personal budget of the Commerce Secretary. Whereupon I eliminated his drivers, his security, his secretaries, everything that was personal staff to Mac Baldrige. It wasn't 24 hours. The phone rang. Lowell, what are you doing to me? He said, you can't do this. I said, oh, yes, Mac, I can. In any event, he got back his staff, and the research vessels were restored to NOAA. Now I have to tell you, the one sad part to it, though, was Mac, shortly thereafter, was killed in a rodeo accident. He loved rodeos, and he landed on his belt buckle and got gutted by his belt buckle. And I say this in sort of a bittersweet way because I adored this man. But the president called me up and he said, we are dedicating a new research vessel, which we want to name the Malcolm Baldrige, and would you please give the speech? I sort of felt like the chief inspector in the Pink Panther when he gives the eulogy over Inspector Clouseau, and no one will laugh or cry during the situation. But I want to make it clear to Mac's family that he was one of the last vestiges of a great moderate Republican in this state, even though we had differences on that issue.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the work that you've done for people with disabilities. And I want to start by talking about one of your 7 sons, Sonny, because I don't think a lot of us living in the world we do today, where people with disabilities have come so far, in part because of work that you did, both personally as a family and publicly as a civil servant or as a public servant. The shock of the story is that when you and your wife gave birth to Sonny, who had Down syndrome, doctors at the hospital said, you shouldn't even take him home.
Right. And that was pretty much the way things went in those days, 1978, but in the 1970s and 60s, all of the disabled mainly were warehoused in institutions here in the state of Connecticut, Mansfield and Southbury. And you were offered the chance of sending your child directly to an institution. Obviously, times have changed. Special ed has gone a long way to making sure that these young men and women can lead a normal life. But the person I give the most credit to is Eunice Kennedy Shriver. And I say that because it shows how any one of us can do anything. You know, you don't have to be a senator or a governor, not even in a presidential family. Eunice did the first Special Olympics in her backyard with about 20 athletes. 20 athletes in their backyard. There are millions of athletes today all around the world. Why was this important? to our effort here at home. Eunice had the smarts to go ahead and marry athletics, which she knew Americans loved, with disabilities. And so for the first time, we all saw this community of the disabled, the disadvantaged, the challenged. We saw them. And when we saw them, it was then possible for legislators like me to go ahead and legislate on their behalf, culminating in the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I want to say one thing here, because the young lady who introduced me when I first came to the old State House said that people who's had differences with each other have been coalescing around downtown Hartford. Let me tell you, you talk about coalescing. Every disability had its own advocate down in Washington. And they all had their own way that they wanted to go. It was only when all the disabilities groups, deaf, Downs, sight, I go right down the whole chest, when they all decided to get together, that you got the Americans with Disabilities Act.
What's Sonny doing these days?
Sonny's independent. He works in Chester, Connecticut. He lives independently. He works independently. He pays taxes. And he just got through with his Special Olympics down in Hamden, I got to tell you one thing about special athletes. Claudia and I are watching this game. This doesn't have to do with Sonny, but it has to do with the goalie on Sonny's team, Dan Winkley. So Dan marches out there and he has this great-looking baseball hat on. He's the goalie. So somebody kicks the ball toward the goal. Dan goes for the ball. While he goes for the ball, his hat falls off. What does he do? He stops to pick up his hat, put it back on his head, and then goes for the ball. Yeah, these kids have their priorities right up.
Let's talk a little bit. This just came up the other day because it was in the paper, and it was such a nice story. Two of Ted Kennedy's sons came to talk to you recently about something that you did that was very important. You were one of the people who really campaigned against apartheid, and in fact, you were the first U.S. senator, sitting U.S. senator, arrested for civil disobedience. I think here's Ted Kennedy, and I think we even have a shot of you being hauled off by the cops.
Right.
So, what did that mean to you to be able to have a voice in that time?
There are two sidebars to that story that you ought to know about in this room. Chris Keating, I might add, of the Hartford Courant, wrote a great article. What he failed to tell you, and my wife has failed to tell you, what he failed to tell you is that the Hartford Courant, who had been a great supporter of mine, really nailed me for going to jail. They thought it was very unseemly for a United States senator to go to jail. There's that aspect that's never been told. And then the other aspect is I was put in jail and Claudia would not come down and post bond. So in any event, no, that was a matter that Ted and I worked together on and achieved a major foreign policy victory, which you seldomly do over a president and a veto override. Mm-hmm. And what surprised us, as I said in the article, was how fast after that apartheid and the Botha government crumbled. And still to this day, the one thing that's the other lesson I think to be learned has nothing to do with Ted and myself. It has to do with Nelson Mandela. My God, if I were stowed away in jail for the length that he was stowed away and lose all my youth and all the joy of youth and family and wife and come out not bitter, I don't know how that works. It certainly wouldn't work for me, but it worked for him, and he managed to pull a country together.
Mm-hmm. This may be adding apples and oranges, but let me make a reference to the Castro regime. If sanctions worked as well as they did against apartheid, why have these sanctions we've had in place for so many years done nothing to dislodge Fidel Castro in Cuba? And I know that you've met him and had a relationship with him.
I think several reasons. First of all, there are two things that Castro did bring to his people, and which they totally lacked. Education. They were last in the world or first in the world in literacy. He brought an education system that's first class. Healthcare. There was no healthcare. This is under Batista and the right-wing regimes. So those two things, healthcare and education, he brought to his own people, which satisfied a majority for quite a while. And then by that time, it was great for us to have sanctions, but the rest of the world didn't have sanctions. So what good does it do for us to have sanctions? Everybody else is there. I think it's the stupidest piece of foreign policy I've ever seen, still is. It's costing hundreds of millions of dollars for us to do this. To what end? So my feeling, my first visit with Castro was to establish a cooperative marine science mission, which was achieved at the Hydro Lab in St. Croix. And secondly was to go ahead and bring back home 7 or 8 American women who had been arrested on drug charges and were in jail. So I accomplished that mission, got all of the women back to the United States, including several from the state of Connecticut.
I don't want to run out of time to either let people ask questions or to talk about your role as governor, so let's get to that. You ran as an independent, as I said. As you were running, you opposed an income tax, and of course the famous quote that everybody knows is, that would be like pouring gasoline on the fires of recession. And yet, months after your election, you put in place, or you were able to persuade the legislature finally to put in place an income tax. Some people said you really had that in the back of your mind all along. That's what you planned to do. But you say, no, that wasn't the case.
No, it's not the case. I'll certainly take the blame for having pushed it. But Bill Sebas can take credit for having the idea.
Notice he's not here today.
I know. That's shared blame. And quite frankly, he had the better idea. Right after I took office, first of all, when I made that statement, the state was $50 million in the hole. By the time we got around to doing our work on the budget, it was $1 billion in the hole. I'd say that sort of changed the circumstances. Yeah. I then had my whole crew at the State House run a non-income tax budget plan. And quite frankly, to achieve a balanced budget for just that year, nothing beyond it, would have required a 13% sales tax. Now, what do you think that would do to middle-income and low-income people? Kill them. So I had my 3 weeks where everything was, including Bill Sebas, pushed every computer around here to get the answer. I gave up. I turned over to him. He pushed the income tax model through, and it was a model that worked, not just to eliminate the deficit, but to make sure we weren't going to run into another deficit. Doesn't do any good, to my way of thinking, in 1 year if you're going to set up yourself for a problem the next year. Now, to those who are opposed to it, I would only say this. You've had 20 years to repeal it. And probably the biggest spenders of that money have been those that were opposed to it, including John Rowland, who added his voice from the sidelines. You had 20 years to repeal it. It has not been repealed, and instead the money has been spent, including, I might add, all the money from Indian gaming, which agreements I also reached during my term as governor. That's been spent. Now, for those that are critical of Dan Malloy right now, I'd say, hold it. He is in exactly the same position I was in. I didn't create the mess that I came to solve. Dan Malloy didn't create the mess that he came to solve. So give him a chance. I don't know if it's going to work out or not, but he ought to have a chance. And he ought to have his ideas and see if they work. Because now we have a $3.5 billion deficit with a projected $6 billion deficit. And that's going to take an awful lot of change around Connecticut, which whether people like it or not, it's the bill come due, and it was the bill come due when I was governor.
Some of the younger people who are in the audience today won't remember this, but there was what they called the Party on the Lawn, the Great Tax Revolt in October 1991. And your Chief of Staff, Tom DeMoore, is here today. You were at the Capitol with Tom, with 40,000 protesters. And here's a shot of it. If you want to see what 40,000 people at State Capitol look like, that's what it looks like. I've never seen anything that big in the state of Connecticut in my time here. Tom and your security guy wanted you to avoid going outside. They wanted you to go through the tunnel that connects the Capitol to the Legislative Office building. You said, no way. and you went out and you talked to people. Tom, was that a bad move? Tom's still holding his breath. Why'd you do that?
Why did I do it? Because
Yes.
it's the United States of America.
Were you afraid?
I think anybody has the right to speak their mind, and I think I have the right to speak mine. Now, did it get a little rough out there? Thanks to a young state trooper by the name of Eddie Semper. Am I correct, Chloe? Yeah, Eddie Semper. He managed to finally, Henry Semper. He managed to drag me out of that mess. But I have to say to you, for anybody to threaten physical violence in the process of our governings, I think is outrageous. I might add, the same thing happened when I went to New London at that period of time to see the Abraham Lincoln portrait by Aaron Copland. Several people threw bottles at Claudia and myself and missed us. I think I hit one of the state troopers. But that just doesn't sell in my book, and I'm not going to hide in the Capitol building. If they're out there, they deserve to hear me, and I deserve to hear them in a civilized way.
When did Tom start talking to you again after that?
Who?
Tom, when did he start talking?
Tom DeMore?
Tom DeMore, yeah.
Well, let me tell you this, that Tom stopped talking to me even before I became governor. I called him up on the phone. That's wrong. As a matter of fact, I met with him in New York because he and others had importuned me to run for governor. And I finally told him, I've made up my mind, come in, we'll talk. And they, of course, were advocating for me to run on the Republican ticket. And I told them, I said, I'm going to run for governor. God, they all smiled. They thought this was great. They were all Republicans then. And I said, but I want to tell you, I'm going to run as an independent. The mood soured very fast. And I think that's when Tom got mad at me, not after.
You did manage to get him to work for you again, though, so I guess
Yes,
he can
he
be
did.
persuaded.
Yes, he did.
Yeah. I want to see if people in the audience would like to ask a few questions now. And if you would, yes, sir, you're going to be first. If you would stand, and we'll try to get to you with a microphone. And it's this gentleman right here. And the microphone. Okay.
I have two questions, and maybe more than one quarter. The first one is, you made a statement that I really have a problem with, Governor, and that is when you came out in your election against Joe Lieberman, suggesting that he voted for the income tax, that was negative campaigning. I always thought the way we picked candidates was to look at what they voted for and pick them on that basis. So I don't call that negative campaigning. I call that constructive campaigning. I'm not looking for an answer to that. I called Malloy's office when this budget came out, having friends in the union. And they told me there was no way that the savings could be, that they could reach that amount of savings. It would take 10 years.
Right.
Under these circumstances, would you have gone along with that budget?
With Malloy's budget?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think it's fair for me to comment at this juncture in the sense that anything I say could be construed for or again. And I think that's why I made in my comments the statement, I want to see how it works out. There are some parts that probably I don't agree with. Certainly, he obviously had to raise revenue. There's no question about that. But I have tried to stay away from commenting on, my successor or what the governor is doing. I think what your problem is in the state of Connecticut has nothing to do with Dan Malloy. I'm going to get back to a very brief remark I made at the outset. You've got a one-party state, and there's no way you've got that tension between two parties that tests every idea. Whatever the Democrats want, the Democrats get. I'm not blaming the Democrats, but what I am saying is it's time the Republican Party started to put up candidates that can get elected in Connecticut. And it'll be a good thing for the state and a good thing for our budgets. Instead, mainly with this income tax money right after I left, you had a corrupt governor, John Rowland, and you had a Democratic legislature that was his lapdog because he was feeding money to it. and nobody was opposing it, and then you end up $6.5 billion in the hole. So to me, the cure for our ills in Connecticut is to get a strong Republican Party going. I'm a little bit encouraged by the fact that I like Jerry Labriola, the Republican chairman. His dad was on the Yale basketball team when I was at Yale. He was a great guard. And I think Jerry is very much of a moderate Republican. Maybe he can swing the party around.
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. My name is Bobby. I was wondering, when you first got elected to be governor in 1990, you publicly commented that you would rather be back in the Senate, that you didn't really like being governor. I was wondering if you could elaborate on what your feelings and thoughts were.
Sure. When you're governor, you're it. You're on the center of the stage, and there's one light spotlighting you. When you're in the Senate, you're one of 100. Now, a lot of senators use that for not doing anything. That wasn't my problem in the Senate. I love doing a lot of things. But you're not the focus of attention every minute of every day. When you're governor, you are. That said, the other side of the coin is you can do so much more as that individual that has the power, the governor. So I enjoyed practicing 30 or 25 years of political skill in being the governor of Connecticut. But it was a lot more fun being a United States senator.
I would say especially when the unions were outside the governor's mansion picketing and saying cut the fat out of the budget, get rid of the governor's chef.
Right. They were out there, they said, fire the cook. Fire the cook. In the meantime, which has always been the case as long as I've been married, I've only had one cook. It's my wife. So my wife is in the kitchen saying, I wish they would.
Yes, right here, ma'am.
One of your absolute finest, shining, courageous, visionary moments, in my estimation, and I don't think it gets enough credit, is in your State of the State speech, January 6, 1993, which ultimately led to the passage of Public Act 93-263. And while it's only the final regional plans only passed in 3 out of the 11 regions that were formed, I believe that the results were magnificent. And it's hard to quantifiably and qualitatively assess the effect of that State of the State speech and your vision and courage and the practicalities that went into the design of it, that were crafted and nudged and molded and gotten through the General Assembly, a lot with Nancy Wyman's tutelage and skill. Do you see any relevance for a redo of that, as the French would say, of the concepts in that put forward in your speech in January 1993, next session 20 years later?
You're talking about education.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and we've not finished that job in the state of Connecticut. And we're nothing special. Neither has anybody in the country. The problem is we've gone from racial segregation to economic segregation, but the impact on education is just the same. There are great places for education, and there are not so great places for education. I still believe, you should know, and I know a lot of people are going to get mad, because everybody in 169 towns likes to have 169 towns do their own thing. But I'm sorry, I think you have got to have state-funded education so that the people in Greenwich, the people in Bridgeport, the people in Hartford, everybody is allotted the same and has to work within a certain framework, whereas not just the wealthy suburban towns. Now, I mean, it's got to be clear that the strength of the United States, and indeed our own state of Connecticut, is due to our diversity. And especially now that we're in a global economy, you need everybody involved in this. Well, we all know the only way that anybody gets there is through education. So somehow people have got to continue to work at busting the economic segregation, which in effect limits educational opportunities for too many children.
Can you keep it short? Okay.
First of all, money's not the problem in our education. We get as much as men feel. So that's not always the answer. The real question I ask you is, what's Obama's problem? He was elected real well, and a lot of people like him. He's still a very personal guy. It's just bad luck or bad policy that's put him in this position of even the ground.
Well, I think, first of all, let me lay my cards on the table so it doesn't come out afterwards that I gave an answer. I plan to support the president in the next election. But the only reason why I say that is so you can evaluate my answer. Let's face it, what he picked up in the way of baggage was considerable. Now, I don't excuse that because he asked for the job, just as I asked for the job in the state of Connecticut. So after 2 to 3 years, you can't say, well, it was the other guy's fault. You own it. What's the pottery barn? You break it, you own it, whatever it is. Well, he owns the economy of this country. I think that probably if I had to lay the cause for much of the difficulty we're encountering, I would lay it at the doorstep both of Obama and the Republican leadership. Listen, I know people like to think this is a citizen government, but the job of a politician, whether you're a senator or first selectman, that's a job. And you got a bunch of people down in Washington, the only thing they do on their job is to say no to each other. How in God's name do you move forward under those circumstances? So I'm not saying that a lot of the no has been from Obama, but just as much no has been from the Republican leadership. And it's been really disheartening. I'm going to tell you right now, if I didn't have a bad pair of legs under me, I'd make my third announcement from this stage and go back down to Washington. But seriously, I'm not saying the president hadn't had his faults. And he's been saying no, or he's been creating political scenarios that make it difficult for Republicans to accept. But that's where the problem lies. It lies on both sides.
Well, since you just almost announced your run for Senate,
yeah.
Would you like to endorse anybody who is currently running?
No. I want to keep all my options open. I have very definite opinions as to the various people involved, and I certainly will endorse somebody, before it's all over. But I think this is premature and this is nonpartisan. I think you have a gentleman there that wants to speak.
Thanks for being here, Governor. Connecticut's had no net job growth, no net job formation in a generation. Is that a problem? And if so, what do you think it will take to get back into competitive equilibrium with states that are growing?
Yeah, that's a good question. The reason why we haven't had much job growth is really sort of twofold. Now, a lot of people like to accuse me of the income tax, but they also forget that an important part of that tax package was reducing corporate income taxes. Not income tax, but corporate taxes. And in a substantial measure. And even today, our corporate the taxes that corporations have to pay are too high. And I know this isn't fair, but I'm going to say it because I think it's also one of our problems. Unfortunately, I think during Dick Blumenthal's reign, and he did a lot of great things, but brother, he'd go ahead and nail corporation after corporation after corporation. And if you're going to know whether you want to come to Connecticut to set up your business, that's a little discouraging. So I'd say between tax policy and how we view the people that we invite here, we want to make this a welcoming state. And you're right. I mean, I'm telling you, I've been to the state capitol several times. Claudia and I live in Old Lyme, and we come up here with see friends and eat. But I hadn't really been in this downtown area. Gee, to see building after building after building totally empty. This used to be a hub of New England, not just the state of Connecticut. So we've got a job to do here, and I think there have to be clearly I might add, the other thing I don't want to see is individual grants to individual corporations. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they don't. There ought to be a tax policy that makes it encouraging to all corporations to come into the state of Connecticut.
Young man in the front, yes.
So I'm curious, what was your inspiration for running for governor as an independent against
as your own party, and how did you expect to win?
The reason I ran as an independent was that I wouldn't have gotten the Republican nomination. It was clear that the Republican Party was going to go ahead and nominate John Rowland. The Senate defeat, aside from the positives on Joe Lieberman beating me, also came about because William F. Buckley and conservative Republicans in downstate Connecticut, in what is called the Gold Coast, had turned against me. I did not lose the election among Democrats. I did not lose it in the cities, nor among minorities. Typical, quite frankly, demographic was not there. I did well in those areas. I did relatively badly in areas like Greenwich, Stamford, New Canaan, Darien, which was my territory. And that was led by William F. Buckley. That was going to happen again if I ran for the Republican nomination. The Republicans would not have given me the nomination. And then you're damaged goods. And then it looks like you're trying to get even. So my thinking very clearly was, I'm not going through that process. I'm going to try to get the signatures. And I might add, I think it was somewhere around 100,000 whenever was necessary, 15, 20. We got the signatures, and I just felt that was the better way to go. What was another part to your question? I'm sorry. That was it.
Yes, right here.
What are your thoughts on the current document investigations?
I don't have a comment. I just don't know. And not really, I'm not privy to the investigation, nor would I comment if I was. Just wouldn't do it.
What about the survival of a Connecticut party?
Well, I'm sorry it's not there still, because I think you do need a third party. If neither of the majors can deliver, then you need the third. I'll lay you odds. If you had a full ticket of people running Connecticut Party in this next election, you'd get a lot elected. I think the country as a whole is in the mood for independence. My good friend Angus King, I can tell you right now, is going to win the United States Senator from Maine as an independent, as he was an independent governor. The whole country, I think, we understand competition in the United States. And just as we believe in corporate policies that produces a better product, so I think it does also in politics. A better candidate and a better officer.
Young man right there. Yeah. You? Yes.
Connecticut is one of the only states which allows same-sex marriage. President Obama recently announced his support of it only a few weeks ago, I think. Is this something that you support?
I have never been prouder of my judicial nominees to the Supreme Court of the state than when they, in effect, made this legal. I can't conceive of what it is that in any way would deny anybody, equal protection of the laws or equality under our Constitution. It's what makes us a strong nation. So I'm 100% for whatever people want to go ahead and do. They cause no harm. Indeed, they cause great happiness. And I am so much against those that for some reason or other feel there's only one way to go. There are many ways to go. You know, the interesting thing, too, is as we now see poll after poll, certainly when I was raised as a youngster, it was unheard of for heterosexuals that you would live with a woman or a woman would live with you if you weren't married. Well, I got news for you. You better take it with the statistics. Most of my son's generation are doing just that. And I'm not saying that, again, I agree or disagree, but that's not the decision for me to go ahead and make. I've always had a great kinship with the gay community in the sense that, and I will show you how you can, bring sunshine into the room sometimes. I was head of the budget for NIH. And the morning that I was to present the budget on the Senate floor, I got a call in my office at 7 o'clock. None of my staff were there. It was just me, and I picked up the phone. This is so-and-so of the Gay Men's Coalition, and we have something we'd like to talk to you about. Could we come up and see you? I said, sure, I'm here alone. I'll leave the door open. And these three gentlemen came up and they said, we understand that there is a substance material, AZT, which has promise in its treatment of AIDS. And it needs $46 million for clinical trials. And I said, my God, I said, in 1 hour I'm going to the Senate floor. How am I going to get $46 million? I said, well, let me call Tony Fauci, Dr. Fauci, who's the head of allergies and infectious diseases over at NIH. I said, Tony, is this true? Could it be effective? And he said, yes, it could. I said, okay, that's all the word I need. And I went down to the floor. I turned to Senator from Wisconsin, Bill Proxmire, and said, Bill, please don't oppose me on this, but I'm going to ask for an emergency appropriation of $46 million for AZT, for the clinical trials of AZT. And I said, I'd like to do it under unanimous consent, because if it comes to a Senate vote, Jesse Helms is coming down here, and we're going to be off to a filibuster, and that's going to be the end of it. So he agreed. We did it under unanimous consent, and it became law. The trials took place. And even today, where there is no vaccine, it is an important part of any cocktail in the sense of somebody that has AIDS. So this is sort of my introduction into the gay community. And I have to say that I'm very partial to them. I'm very proud of our own Supreme Court. I could give you one little amusing aspect of this, and there's not much that's amusing. I went out to San Francisco for a fundraiser. And San Francisco, as you well know, was in the throes of an epidemic of AIDS. And it was given to me, fundraiser was given at a private club, and I invited my brother Ted and his wife to join me there, and then we'd go out for dinner afterwards. Ted was a big macho ex-Marine, decorated during the Korean War. So I'm in the receiving line, saying hello to everybody, and Ted walks in, and I said, Ted, just, if you don't mind, just while I'm finishing up on the receiving line here, just go into the bar and have a drink, and then we'll hook up. About 10 minutes later, Ted comes back to me and said, Lowell, can I talk to you? I said, sure. He said, I think everybody in here is gay. I said, you're right. But in any event, God bless. I'm glad we're at that point where people can do what they want to go ahead and do.
We have time for about 2 more questions. Yes.
Another question. Back in June of 1993, you signed the Radiology Safety Act in Connecticut. At that time, there were many states that have no law about taking radiology, taking x-rays. And we're still in Washington trying to pass a federal one. But I remember Eunice Quirk, our lieutenant governor, asked me to come in and explain to her what the radiation bill was all about. And I have a pen that you signed when we finally passed it with the help of Eunice Quirk. And Nancy Wyman was a radiology technologist.
Eunice Quirk was a great lieutenant governor.
She was wonderful.
And can you imagine what our state would have been like had they elected her governor, in other words, after I left? Yeah. What a mistake on the part of the state that was.
It was John Larson and Eunice Quirk, Nancy, and I have a pen that you signed that bill with.
I think there was a question right over here. Yes.
Just as a follow-along to a recent other session that we had here at the State House, what is your thought about holding a constitutional convention and trying to make some amendments to the state constitution?
I'm sorry, having a constitutional convention?
Yeah.
A Connecticut State Constitutional Convention and trying to get some amendments or changes to our state constitution.
Oh, I have no problem with that. I have no problem. That's the system. And if people feel that there are changes to be made, it should happen that way. No problem at all. I don't know if there's a specific issue that's on the table here, but whatever the case, that's the process, and it should be used. I think there was a lady way in the back that wanted.
Okay. Yes.
Governor, I wondered if first of all, if there's any chance of a reversal of the Supreme Court decision that allows a corporation to be an individual. And if it did ever happen, whether that would reinvigorate our political scene.
Yeah, you're talking about the super PACs.
Mm-hmm.
Well, obviously, this is distorting. I mean, money's been distorting the system for a long time. This is just jumping over the cliff right now. What should happen is very clear. The Congress of the United States can remedy this. And that's the way it ought to happen. And it's time that people in this country, if they want their vote to count and their opinion to count, then you ought to get rid of this concept that you can hide behind a super PAC and just pour money, most of which is negative campaigning, almost entirely negative campaigning. But that has to be handled by the Congress.
I'd like to take a question from over here. Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you, Governor, for being here today. You obviously have a lot of opinions on things that are going on. This is entitled Reconnecting with the Governor. John Rowland has a radio show. Why don't we hear more from you?
Why don't you hear more from him? Me? Oh. Well, first of all, nobody's asked me. That's as good a reason as any. It takes a lot of work to go ahead and do one every day of the week. Would I mind appearing occasionally on radio shows? No problem with that. But now the time has come for me to sort of slowly, pull in. My papers are at the University of Virginia. They're doing an oral history down there, as they're doing an oral history for Senator Kennedy, and that'll be done probably within a year's time. And then from time to time, when I get good people like Diane asking me to come and speak, I will. When I start embarrassing Claudia, then I won't.
Speaking. I'll do one more question. This woman in the second row, yeah.
Question with you, sir. Thank you for all the good that you've done for Connecticut so far. We thank you so much. And I just want to ask you a quick question. Did you know that God loves you and has a great plan for your life? Do you know that?
Yes, I do.
Wonderful. May I ask you how you know?
May you what?
May I ask you how you know?
Well, I tell you exactly how I know. I have a great minister down in Old Lyme, Connecticut, who just retired yesterday or the day before. And the reason why I love him, he goes ahead and stands up there every morning and tells what it is that we can do in the world today. I think the Old Testament and New Testament is great, but I think, quite frankly, the world needs us in many different ways. And he's inspired me to that extent. And then, if that's not good enough, my great uncle, who's in heaven, was the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Okay. Do you have a question?
Governor, I had the opportunity to talk with you before the program, and thank you for all the work during your active political career on behalf of people with disabilities. And you said that there's much more that needs to be done. What would you like to see?
That's very easy. The laws that have been passed, both the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Education of All Handicapped Children Act, the funding is not there. You can have all the laws in the world in this country, but if the funding isn't there, nothing happens. That's the reason why when I was given a choice of what committee I wanted to serve in the Senate, I went to Appropriations, because that's where the rubber meets the road. And clearly both the executive, Department of Education, and the Congress, and the local communities are not funding special education the way it is by law supposed to be funded. And I realize that's tough, because it's tough times for everybody. But the problem is, the cuts are not equal. They figure, let's take it out of special ed first, because those are the fewer votes. And the special ed that gets hit first.
Governor, I want to wrap up this conversation by asking you, let's say 20 years from now, two guys walk into a bar, they start talking politics, your name comes up. What do you hope they say about you?
Oh gosh, I think I'd like to be known for the disabilities work, number one, and all the laws that I wrote and are still the laws on the books today, because they were the frailest of our citizens. Then I wish they would talk about how I preserve the National Institutes of Health, which relates to all of us, and the work that I did on health care. which is going to be a big issue in the coming campaign. No American deserves to be without health care. No American. And then with those two, I'd be very happy if that's where the discussion centered. I like to think, look, when I had the power, I did the best I could with it. I realize that some people feel I used to be a little roughshod in the way I went at things. But I also know that the people that don't hope for good things play a tough game. It's a tough game out there. But it should be fair between the two sides. And in the final analysis, you're sent to Washington or you're sent to Hartford, not on behalf of those who have everything. They don't want government. Fine, they don't have to have government. But you're sent there to go ahead and create a better life for those that in some way lack it. That, to me, is the purpose of government.
Thank you so much, and thanks for giving us